Pakistan is a country with great potential. Now, Pakistan, in my opinion, is ready. Right now is the best time for investors to come to our country.
Now, Pakistan's stock market is booming. Stock prices are at their highest level ever, and investments are pouring in.
Spending more than $50 billion on energy and infrastructure in Pakistan.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम। आज के
वालेकुम सलाम।
हवाले से बहुत ज़्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट है कि we're going to be discussing about our business ethics, that how we actually try going about doing a business. And fundamentally the issue is that we talk about the ideas, we talk about the processes, the creation, finding a problem, and then building a team. But what fundamentally we don't talk about it is to how to go about it in terms of what would be the ethics for it. And because of that, since we haven't done really well from the ethics point of view, when we actually go global, the practices are very different. So that's what we're going to be discussing. And I have a very distinguished guest today with me, Shaykh Ameer Hamza, who's going to be discussing with me about different issues and bringing in a lot of examples from the history and from the actual seerah, that how some of the billionaires of their times actually did the business. So Ameer, could you please introduce yourself first of all, a little bit, tell us about your background, and then we can go about actually discussing the topic.
Absolutely. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. My name is Ameer Hamza. They call me nowadays Imam Ameer Hamza. I was actually born in Pakistan, and I grew up there, and we moved to the United States in 2001. So about the first 12 years of my life were spent in Pakistan. Then when my family moved here, I started my education here from high school onwards, college, all in the United States. Alhamdulillah, I did a bachelor's in accounting. And I worked in the corporate world for about 4 years as a senior analyst, financial analyst, accountant. I was part of the finance leadership development program. But as after 4 years into my corporate career, I had what I like to call a early midlife crisis. And I decided to jump ships and pursue Islamic studies because I felt that was my calling. And I felt that's what gave me chills and goosebumps. And this is something I deeply wanted to pursue. So I pursued Islamic studies for about 4 years at Qalam Institute. And upon completing that last year, alhamdulillah, I returned back to Milwaukee, which is where we moved when we first moved from Pakistan. And now I'm serving as an imam, as a youth director at the Islamic Society of Milwaukee. And here we are. I'm really, really happy and excited to have a discussion here, inshallah, live with you all.
Okay, Jazakallah. So that was an amazing journey in terms of actually how you came from corporate sector into actually Islamic education and really pursued it over the time, which usually doesn't happen. I mean, once you actually on a path, on the career is already set,
Yes.
then you go and just carry on with it. But the good thing is, like, I think you'll be able to actually bring in a lot of examples from the current age as well. So it's not just about the actual seerah part of it or how the early Sahaba actually did this. So my first question is how you see it. I mean, whether you're doing a business or not doing a business. So let's actually focus on the ethics part of it, how important it is in our daily lives, that if you're trying to actually cut the corners, while dealing with other Muslims or non-Muslims,
Mm.
who they are, how would it affect, or have you seen any examples, how would they affect internally with people?
Mm. SubhanAllah, this is such a deep topic. Personally, I am so passionate about this topic, and I'm very happy, and I commend you for doing this and organize this session. Let me start out with a quote that I like to say a lot, and that is, if you won't honor the process, God will not honor the promise. That's really at the bottom, at the heart of this matter. We don't want to forget who we are in the process of becoming rich. And you don't want to check out God on the door of your success. Ethics is at the heart of what we do as Muslims. That's what defines our Islamic practice. You see, and this is something I want to share with the audience. Our religion is not something that exists in silos. That you have iman in your mind, or you have certain beliefs that you hold, and that's it. It stops right there. Necessarily, it must translate, spill into actions. And here I'd like to share with you, I think I'm building a foundation, and then we'll come to the actual ethics side of things. If you open the earliest books of Islam, and I'm talking about books much earlier than even Sahih al-Bukhari. I'm talking about Musannaf or Abdul Razzaq, the earliest books of hadith that we have. Some of the OGs of Islamic scholarship, some of the earliest scholars of Islam that we have on record, from Sufyan al-Thawri and others, all of them define iman, faith, as qawlun wa amal, statements and actions. Meaning they married faith with actions, with deeds. And that's why in the Quran, even faith in the ladina amanu wa amilu salihat is combined over like 70 times. Why? Religion was not, iman was not just supposed to be lip service, a cool slogan, calligraphy on the walls. It was supposed to color your actions. It was supposed to shape your morals. Unfortunately, in modern times, with many Muslims, we have managed to do the unthinkable, and that is divorce ethics from religion. Can I share with you a story that happened to my uncle? My uncle manages a plant in Pakistan. He was a manager of one of the plants in Pakistan. And what happened is that once he received an electricity bill, and at that time, I'm not sure what the situation now is, utility companies were nationalized. So now, once he received an electricity bill that was insanely high, there's no way that this was right, because it was 4 times above the average. There had to be a glitch in the system. Now, to get this problem resolved, if you want to hit up customer service, you got to go to a government agency. Long story short, he goes to one of the government agencies trying to get this problem solved, and he's sitting in the lobby waiting for one of the officers to turn to him. And the door of the officer's office is open, so he can hear what he's saying to his secretary. And the officer says to his secretary, aaj din sahi nahi ja raha. Day is not feeling well today. Why? Because after a long time today, my streak of praying Fajr in the front row has broken. Wow. And my entire day is just off track, and things are just not clicking. And my uncle sitting in the lobby, he's like, I'm about to deal with a farishta, with an angel. This is going to be a walk in the park. Or so he thought. He walks inside the office when it's his turn. The officer says, close the door, come close. And he says, how can I help? And my uncle shows him the bill, and he says, there had to be a glitch here. This can't be right. Officer looks at the bill, and he tells my uncle, so you want me to fix this for you? My uncle is like, yes. And then the officer says, so if I fix this for you, what's in it for me? Stuff. Bluntly asking for a bribe. And my uncle's jaw dropped. He's like, aren't you the same guy who was just complaining that you missed your Fajr in the front row after a long time? You broke your streak? And now the officer got upset, and he's like, Bhai sahab, deen apni jagah pe, dunya apni jagah pe. There you go. This is the crisis in the modern world when it comes to the Muslims, that ummah somehow put deen and dunya. Or as Christians say, let the affairs of Jesus be to Jesus and Caesar be to Caesar. This is a tragedy. And subhanAllah, Quran Bhai, I'm sure you can attest to this. How many are the Muslims who, when they're looking for a business partner, do not go to another Muslim, because in the name of faith and solidarity and fidelity, they have been shortchanged? It's tragic, wallahi, and we need to bring that back. And that's how the ummah is going to revive once more.
So, I mean, this is the reason we are actually doing the session, because in my opinion, I think this is the fundamental issue. If we actually solve this issue, and in earlier part, I mean, pretty much like when we actually claim that the Muslims, when this claim comes up that how the Islam spread, and we bring in that no, it wasn't just because of the sword, because Indonesia, Malaysia, and Far East, like actually the scholars went in and they actually with their conduct they convinced people, and that's how the people actually converted to Islam. So,
Absolutely.
and this has gone away from our daily lives, but more so from the businesses part. So, for instance, where the primary audience is right now in terms of actually in Pakistan and India and that part of the world, they actually have a severe problem in terms of like this uh, bringing in some other elements into the actual core what you're selling. The transaction itself is not clean, that you're actually jacking up the prices. You price hoarding, you're actually don't have a refund policy,
Mm,
and all those kind of things. So I want to actually focus on the business element. So especially when the new entrepreneurs are coming into this field and they are actually bringing in their products and building new services, how would they start? What would their core value would be for their startup?
mm,
So you can start with this. I mean, what in your opinion would be the very first thing they should, whether it's a refund policy where they make sure that their product is rightly priced in terms of the profits? What's your top most important thing they should
mm.
be taking care of?
When it comes to okay, that's a very deep question and a very profound question. I think I think the entire conversation should start with the famous hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is a hadith we're all familiar with. But unfortunately, people hear this hadith and they chalk it up to this unattainable standard, which is really not. And I feel like the modern ethical framework that has developed and the humanistic framework that has developed, they actually try to live up to this, known as the golden rule in other cultures and vernaculars. The Prophet ﷺ says, hadith comes in Bukhari and Muslim, that لا يؤمن أحدكم, you have not truly believed, you have not achieved true iman until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. That's the starting point. That in business, you treat others, your customer, as you would want to be treated had you been in their shoe. That has to be the starting point of any ethical conversation, is that if you would not want to be at the receiving end of a deal that you're giving, the terms that you're extending, then how can you then accept that for your customer? I think that's the fundamental, and I think every other business practice has to be judged in light of that. So for instance, a refund policy can be a lack of refund policy where as soon as you step outside of the store, the seller doesn't even know you anymore. He's like, Bhai Saab, I'm sorry, who are you again? This type of a behavior, well, what if you were the customer who genuinely received a defective product? Would you not want your rights? Would you not want justice to be meted out? You would. Then you love for your brother what you love for yourself, or you love for your customer what you love for yourself as the customer. I think this would be the starting point of the ethical conversation. And then on top of that, of course, the Prophet ﷺ has numerous hadith on being honest. For instance, the Prophet ﷺ used to say, "La yabi' ba'dukum ala bay'i ba'd," that when a seller and a buyer have entered into a contractual relationship, let not the other party come in now and try to sway and talk the seller out of giving that contract to the customer that he promised and give it to somebody else. The second principle, actually, after the golden rule, that I would recommend for people, and I would put it simply, and that is, and comes in the Quran so many times that Quran, you will be mind boggled, and that is, Allah says, "Bala man awfa bi'ahdihi." In another place, Allah says, وَأَوْفُوا بِالْعَهْدِ إِنَّ الْعَهْدَ كَانَ مَسْئُولًا. That live up to your words. Live up to your contractual commitments. Just because it becomes inconvenient or unprofitable, you don't just back out now. إِنَّ الْعَهْدَ كَانَ مَسْئُولًا. And in the Quran, generally when there's an unethical practice or a sin, of course you'll see a punishment or a threat of punishment. But rarely does Allah combine multiple punishments for one act. But in one place in Quran, Al-Imran, literally 5 punishments are promised, one after another, in the same verse, for who? إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَشْتَرُونَ بِعَهْدِ اللَّهِ وَأَيْمَانِهِمْ ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا. Those people who sell their oaths, which they forged in the name of God. They took oath in the name of Allah to get a deal through. Allah ki qasam mere bhai, ye bada high quality material hai. You know, people say whatever, baji Allah ki qasam, main jo hai ek takke ka munafa nahi kar raha hu. You know, people will say whatever. Whoever uses Allah's name or makes an oath and then sells that oath, meaning betrays that oath for a petty profit, some petty coins, Allah says, La khalaqa lahum fil akhirah. They have no share in the hereafter. Wala yukallimuhum Allah. And that's bad enough. Then Allah says, Allah won't even talk to you. You can't even make your case. Wala yanzuru ilayhim. And Allah won't even look at you. Forget not talking to you. Won't even look at you. And you won't have a chance of atoning yourself that day. And they will have a painful punishment. This is how much religious integrity matters to Allah. Ethical integrity, ethical uprightness matters to Allah, man. So those two things I think would be the starting point, the golden rule, and being upfront, upright with your words and commitments.
Okay, so that's good. Let's just start with this, that those two things. Now you embark on a journey, and this is where you have like set the core values of the business. You said, okay, fine, I'm just going to actually really follow that. And then you have a higher purpose for your business. So you're not just doing it for earning a living, but also you want to actually set a standard for yourself that, okay, I'm going to actually set an example. People would just call my business as the most ethical one. And then ultimately they would say that, okay, that's how the Muslims actually do the business. Now, moving on, you are surrounded by all those businesses, those practices, those cultures, which are just like really bombarding you. It's really hard to compete because, all around you is like really mayhem. It's just, there are no rules, there's no regulations. They are just like really just living for the day. They are not thinking about the future. They are not worried about the actual, yes, the practices about, as you earlier said, like in terms of the example that this guy is actually worried about like his Fajr prayer, but not worried about like what the bribery he's taking. So how to deal with it? I mean, does this strong iman kicks in, or what happens then?
Man, this is at the heart of it. So, let me I like to use a phrase called when you're about to do something bad, how we have a guilt security system inside of us that activates, you feel uneasy. When, for instance, when the scientists, they say when a person lies for the first time, their eyes begin to twitch, heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up. These are all physiological signs that human beings were programmed not to lie. So we all experience this guilt when you're doing something wrong. But human beings are very good at snoozing the guilt alarm. And how do you do that? You make a lot of excuses. You rationalize. We're very good at rationalizing. Like my newborn, he cries a lot. Yeah, but you can kind of pacify him and put him to sleep. Or we do that to our conscience. Zamir ko jo na sula diya bhai. Okay. One of the top ways you snooze the guilt alarm. Here we go. The most famous excuse of all time. Everybody's doing it. Sab kar rahe hain. It's the norm of the day, bro. That's how you survive. No, I gotta get with the flow. Like I can't be the only righteous dude on the block. Like, how am I supposed to survive? I mean, particularly back in the days. And again, I'm not commenting on the current state of Pakistan because I'm not woke to that reality. But back in the days when I would hear conversations between my parents and grandparents or whatever, police would get a lot of bad rep. That police people, if they pull you up for something, instead of giving your license, 100 rupees ki note rakh do, inshallah, you'll be on your way. That type of conversations. But you ask one of that police officer, like, you're taking a bribe, rishwat le rahe ho yaar, haram and this and that. What is the first thing they're going to tell you? That's how you survive. Everybody's doing it. So now when somebody's starting a business and they're trying to get ahead, they're going to feel that pressure as well, that I need to make progress. And if doing bribe is the way to go, then it is what it is. I have no other choice. What do you tell that person? This is where iman definitely has to come in. And that iman specifically that I'm referring to is iman in the hereafter. The one day you're going to have to stand in front of Allah after living this temporary 50, 60-year life. And you have to ask yourself, is it worth it to gamble your hereafter for the gains of this world? Or as I like to say, do you really want to eat junky stuff as an appetizer and miss out on the actual delicious, legitimate meal? Well, hereafter is the meal. This world is the appetizer. And people are putting haram things in their body and financing a haram lifestyle. But the real life that's going to come up, you're jeopardizing that because of a materialistic advantage here. I'll give you all a quick example. There was a business being run in Pakistan that I learned about. Is that people, what they were doing, they were importing thermostats. And they're importing it from China, of course, because everything's made there, or so they say. Then what were they doing? Here's a business model. They'll take the sticker off from China, where it says made in China, and they would put made in Japan or made in America. Why? So they can make a premium, of course. I mean, they have, excuses are dime a dozen. Everybody's doing it. You look at any of our competition, this is business as usual. In fact, they will go on to say, even the customers know. So, koi badi baat nahi. This is where hereafter, there is no morality without hereafter. If you take hereafter out of the way, then you do as you please. You've got 60 years, you're going to die. If you take subhanAllah, if you take hereafter completely out of the conversation and you have this scientific, materialistic, secularistic, atheistic worldview, then yeah, you got 60 years to live. You looked into consciousness for 60 years. You popped into existence and you'll be thrusted out of existence. In that case, if that's your worldview, then yeah, you live for the self, you be selfish and you party it out and you maximize the time you have here. Who really cares about right and wrong at this point? Because there's no ultimate reward or punishment. But if you do subscribe to a hereafter and you got to stand in front of God, a small amount of halal risk is better than a lot of haram. And Allah will give you barakah and contentment through that little that you will not find in a lot. And I am a firm believer, and inshallah I'll share some examples of this. Someone who's upright with their values, Allah will eventually open doors. It may take some time, but it always occurs that if you were doing the right thing, eventually doors will open up to you, that halal risk will become a lot more because Allah will put barakah.
Okay, so that's exactly my next question is going to be, because yes, you can have a strong iman, you can actually fight back, but not everyone can actually do that. So the vast majority of people, especially the youth, they need some really good examples. They need those idols. Basically, they want to see that it has happened in the past and people have been successful. That's why we actually all the time, when it comes to entrepreneurship, we give an example of Steve Jobs. We give more recently, we tell about, like, okay, this is Elon Musk has changed all the records. He's actually thought something that he's going to actually go to the Mars, and he's one step forward when we actually saw the launch. So when the youngsters actually see that, they set this, worldview in their mind. So, and unfortunately, what has happened in our generation, that we haven't been able to actually brought out those great examples from the past, especially from this era, and then show it to them that, okay, this is how they did the business. This is how they led their lives. That's how they spent their lives. That's how they interact with the youth. That's how they interacted with the wider community. So if you could just shed some light on those.
Absolutely. So there's a motto called doing business properly is profitable. This is something, by the way, I mean, I'll give some Islamic examples, of course, but even in the modern world right now, particularly on the American landscape, there are studies being released right now which show that business that have been ethical for the long term end up producing a lot more shareholder value, a lot more dividends than businesses who resort to shady practices. Classic example of this, of course, is the Enron Corporation, that was essentially whistleblowing happened, the lid was blown, and eventually their unethical practices were exposed to the public. And sure, they may have delivered a lot of profit in the short term, and ethical businesses who are looking at the stock market, they're looking at the income statement, they're like, look at this. We're doing the right thing. We're not anywhere near what they're delivering. But see, that's what it is. It's a short-term sporadic spike, and then eventually it catches up to you. So right now, studies are coming out that long-term ethical business models are actually much more sustainable. Doing business right actually pays off. So this is from a secular modern perspective, let alone we'll come to the religious perspective in a second. We're seeing Harvard case studies coming out on that front. Having said that, when we think about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, subhanallah, they firmly believed in the concept of barakah. And that is that barakah, let me translate barakah in a way that's actually more meaningful to our audience who may not be familiar with religious discourse. Barakah is one of two things. Barakah is either you get more out of your money, or what your money was going to be directed to in terms of unforeseen circumstances, that is nullified or negated. I always give an example. If I have $100 in my bank account and I want to use those $100 towards things that actually benefit me, are meaningful to me. Now, barakah will happen in one of two ways. That I get a lot more out of those $100 and I really get to fulfill my needs. That will be one way a barakah will manifest itself. Or Allah will protect that $100 ending up in places that are not the places I want to spend my money. Like for instance, all of a sudden the car breaks down. All of a sudden my cell phone shatters. All of a sudden that $100 got directed in a direction that was not an immediate priority for me, but it became because I had no choice. That's barakah for you. So for companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and others, they firmly believed in this, that long-term barakah, long-term profitability lies in doing things right. Let me give you an example. Umar bin Khattab was famous for this, and he made sure that his children were upholding this. Umar bin Khattab had a son named Abdullah ibn Umar. Abdullah ibn Umar, what he did, is a smart businessman. So he managed to get his hands on 4 camels, which were in a really bad shape. It's kind of like when you find cars in a junkyard and you fix them up, or you flip houses. So he's flipping camels. So we found 4 camels in really bad conditions. Now, at that time in Medina, under Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu's reign, there were public pastures, and there were public employees assigned to taking care of that pasture. And anybody can come and put their camels there, and the public employees would overall ensure that camels are around, like running off somewhere, there's enough pasture, there's enough water. So that's what Abdullah ibn Umar did. He's like, all right, here are 4 camels. I'm just going to put them in the public pasture land. Over a few weeks, they're going to become hopefully a little bit more fed, and they'll appear a little bit more muscular. And then I'll see if I can sell them and make a profit. So what happened? After a few weeks, these camels fattened up. And now when they come back to the market, Umar bin Khattab would actually inspect the markets. And he saw these fat camels, like buff camels. And he's like, whose camels are these? They're like, yeah, Amir al-Mu'mineen, that's your son. MashaAllah, like he knows what he's doing with his camels. So Umar bin Khattab was like, how did he manage to find the time and the resources to turn his camels into this? Like, because he's busy teaching as well. Abdullah ibn Umar, he's busy learning, he's a student. So Umar bin Khattab investigated and found out that he had taken those camels to the public pasture, and that's where they achieved this muscular profile that we see right now. And Umar bin Khattab actually became upset, and he said to Abdullah ibn Umar, you think out of all the camels, your camels became this fat, and that's a coincidence? You don't think people, the public employees who are taking care of the pasture land, you don't think it crossed their mind that these camels are the camels of the son of the Khalifa? Then perhaps they extended your camels a little bit more favoritism and a little more attention and a little more resources than they perhaps would have given to the camels of an average farmer and an average Joe? You think this is a coincidence that your camels look so premier and premium over others? No, you were given consciously or subconsciously favoritism and favorite treatment because you're my son. And then he tells his son, sell your camel, take the initial capital that you put into this, and rest of the profit goes to the public treasury. And that's what he did.
So basically, this was the standards, and I mean, hard to really, follow those standards. But I mean, if you look at it like in terms of the actual, the real value we are bringing it to the people. I mean, that when you actually do a business, when you actually try to come up with the idea to solve a problem and then turn that into a business, Yes, there are going to be examples when we saw that from Prophet Amir al-Mu'minin, for instance, Umar Razulullah Ta'ala, because that's when the real business happened. Um, but some of the examples I wanted to actually see that if um, like Usman Razulullah Ta'ala, for instance, Abdurrahman bin Auf, Zubair, Talha Razulullah Ta'ala anhum. Now, these were the people who, if with the current time, if you look at it, like for instance, their wealth accumulated over the time, and when you actually convert to the value of today, that goes into billions. I mean, they were literally a billionaire of their own time. I mean, so much so that all of the wealth of Usman Azza was given away when he died in inheritance, or the third of it to the people. And yet there were like so much wealth which couldn't be distributed. And now we have his own bank account is still being run in Saudi right now, in Medina. I mean, how could that happen, basically, with such a, ethical business practices?
Subhanallah, that's a phenomenal and profound point. How did this happen? Of course, Uthman radiallahu anh, being one of the 10 who were promised paradise, he's going to uphold the most incredible, impeccable standards of ethics. We know that for a fact. And on top of that, Uthman radiallahu anh wasn't only known for being a shrewd businessman, he was known for being a philanthropist, someone who actually gave back a lot. And they genuinely were convinced by the notion that that when you give charity, when you give back, it actually doesn't reduce your wealth. And their life, especially the way their lives ended, and the massive wealth and inheritance that they're left behind, are a testament to the fact that them giving back, them upholding the highest standard of ethics, did not backfire, did not mean that they're going to lose out. And in the United States, a modern example of this is, you'll see this when companies will try to get ahead by cutting corners, or, for example, overlooking certain accounting practices, or they won't do a thorough quality control. What happens inevitably, eventually a lawsuit will occur, and bam, all that profit you made will be wiped out. It occurs over and over again. We see this. On the other hand, you have companies like Tesla, for instance. They made their patents known to the public. Yet, as far as we know, their trajectory is going up. So I think bad business practices eventually catch up to you. And we have numerous case studies now to prove that this is no longer just a Imani conversation where you just have to have some sort of a faith in the unseen here, or a metaphysical thing. Just take a look at some of the modern businesses, particularly on the American landscape, the amount of lawsuit they were subjected to. I mean, recently, Facebook, the massive penalty that was imposed on them after the whole compromising that happened in the elections. Or for instance, Google's being fined by EU billions. I mean, we're not talking millions here, we're talking about billions of companies who may have become lax on certain regulations, and the hammer came down. It's just not worth it. Look, you're gonna make some profits. Sure, you may even add $2-3 million to your bottom line. But when the liability hits and the divine justice kicks in, eventually it's just, you're like, I did all of this for nothing. It just sucks. You not only consume haram, and then eventually the haram leaves you anyways. It's a fool's paradise, really, what it is.
So one thing to be noted here, I mean, especially from the viewer point of view, that I mean, this especially back home, I mean, people have this back in their minds that everything is perfect when it comes to Western world. The practices usually the businesses do, they are like really from the times of our elders, from the Sahaba time, and their example has been given that the laws has been actually driven from that time, that has how Umar Razulullah Ta'ala actually sort of like ran his estate. So that's not always the case. I mean, there are companies, you see the corruption in the US, you see the malpractices in Europe. So that continuously happens, but it's just this regulatory environment which actually makes sure that the things actually go into the right direction. So I'm just going to go back into some more examples, if you can actually recall from the Sahaba's time, that how the Sahaba actually did the business, and they chose to do a business, and they chose not to do the business. So, for instance, in Abu Hurairah's case, like he actually could do a business and could get involved, but he chose to being a student full time, and he would just go empty stomach all the time. So those 2 points basically.
Let me take a step back and share a philosophical principle that underlines your business practice. And I strongly and firmly believe in this. This is something you either unconsciously believe or you don't. If you do believe, it's going to influence the business model, the business practice, the business ethics that you follow. And if you do believe, it will influence you. What is that? At the heart of the way we view this world or the way we operate in this world, every single one of us has to have conviction in this particular principle, and that is my risk a function primarily of my hard work, or is there divine providence? It's a very important principle, and based on where you stand, you're gonna find yourself acting and conducting accordingly. If you believe that your success is primarily of your making, and you are the pure, exclusive architect of your success, then you're going to have a very Machiavellian type of a worldview where almost by any means necessary, you'll do whatever you need to do to succeed. You just got to get ahead. And you just got to make it through, and you got to catch up to the competition. These tend to be the individuals who will, if necessary, cross certain ethical lines. If you need to bribe officials, if you need to go into a country and do some kickbacks, it is what it is. We got to get ahead because ultimately I got to do what I got to do. And even if a person is not indulging in shady practices, this person will work day and night because they in their mind think they are the ones who control their risk. So there's a level of anxiety. There's a lack of trepidation. There's always a sense of anxiety is one word. Pareshani jisko bolte hain. You're constantly like a dog chasing. You're always working. On the other hand, when you introduce a little bit of divine providence, you understand that the risk that you have written for you will come to you. You just have to work hard and get it. And the Prophet ﷺ told us that whatever Allah has decreed for you will come to you before you die. Now you got a choice. Will you attain it through the halal lanes or the haram lanes? So what that does, it takes the edge off of this Machiavellian, this self-centered worldview that I alone control whether I make $1 million or $1 billion. And it introduces a third-party element that Allah has kind of put a cap on what you're going to earn. There's no need to kill yourself in the process of making that money, because to some level it will come to you. You just got to do your best. God will do the rest. Having said that, companions of the Prophet ﷺ were clearly in the second camp. They understood that their risk, and Allah says, وَمَا مِن دَابَّةٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ إِلَّا عَلَى اللَّهِ رِزْقُهَا, that Allah has taken responsibility for people's risk. Because they were convinced of that, they weren't cutthroat in the way they did business. There was a lot more contentment. Abu Hurairah that you mentioned, for instance, he dedicated early part of his life seeking knowledge, because he knew even if he is not fully being an entrepreneur, putting 8 to 5, running a business, he somehow knew that I can still make a living because Allah, as long as I'm doing something fruitful, Allah will take care of me. That mindset was always there. I feel like a lot of times people resort to unethical practices when they feel like they alone are responsible for how their business comes out. True, but you don't. A really good book I recommend is Outlier by Malcolm Gladwell. He points out that yes, your success a lot of times comes down to your hard work. There's a 10,000-hour rule, but there are always opportunities that are presented your way that end up shaping and defining how the trajectory of your life unfolds. You can't take that thing out of the picture. So one of the great companions of the Prophet ﷺ, Miswar ibn Makhrama, his phenomenal, what happened in Medina, there was a drought, and he was a businessman, and recently he had bought a lot of inventory of something that basically is no longer found in the marketplace. So immediately the demand of what he was selling went up. Now what happened is that he could literally make a killing, just kind of like what people are doing with water bottles and Purell and Clorox wipes. They've disappeared. So there are a lot of memes running around. One spurt for $5, that's ihtikar, that's hoarding something that public needs. He could have done that, but of course, he being an ethical businessman, he still sold it. But something interesting happened. When the drought came to an end, Miswar says, I saw clouds on the horizons of Medina, gray clouds, and they're approaching Medina. And I knew rain's on the way. And he says, immediately when I saw the clouds and the rain's on the way, I felt a sense of unknowingness in my heart, sense of dislike, because he knew that his business advantage is now coming to an end because it's about to rain and drought is about to be over. He's like, the moment I felt that in my heart, I felt so disgusted that how can something that would be of benefit to Muslims, I find it to be distasteful. So he went to Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu and says, Ya Amirul Mu'mineen, whatever inventory I have left, I kind of want to donate it away. I don't want to carry this filth. I don't want to carry this type of a feeling in my heart. And then he actually donated. Who would do something like that unless you are convinced that there is a divine element to your success? That's what Iman introduces. And I hope this is another principle our Muslim businessmen carry with them, and Muslim businesswomen as well.
Okay, so I don't know whether you had the experience of actually looking into specifically or specialize in that particular field. That, I mean, what are those practices? So, for instance, like in terms of like refunding policy, that whether the person actually likes the product or not, and then we actually bring that into our businesses, or for instance, in terms of actually how I'm going to keep my books in a current scenario. I mean, obviously, the private company is private company. You go and file the taxes and everything. I mean, obviously, that's not public, but you can disclose that kind of information. That's another element. The third element is how you treat with your employees, for instance. That's a very important element in your doing a business. That how you actually treat them. Do you actually treat them on the same level? How you disperse their salaries? Is it on time? Like, for instance, that the sweat thing that give the mazduri to the person who actually worked for you before their sweat up. So I mean, those kind of things. What you want to say about those? I mean, very specific practices while we are doing a business.
So let's start with the first area. You mentioned the first area was refund policy. What is a refund policy? Particularly in the Hanafi school of thought, you have the concept of khiyar. Khiyar is basically optionality, or option that a person, particularly a customer, has when it comes to treating a product after they've bought it. And there are different types of khiyars. For example, there's khiyarul ru'ya. There is khiyarul aib, for instance. There are different types of khiyar that a person has. So in the Hanafi school of thought, which is the madhab that is being practiced in Pakistan predominantly, or in subcontinent for that matter, a buyer has a right, when they look at the product and they find a fault or defect, they have the right religiously to go back and return the product and claim a refund. So I don't know, some people perhaps mistakenly equate lack of refund with like some sort of Islamic policy. There's not. There are different types of ru'ya. In fact, some scholars in the other school of thoughts even argue that there's something called khiyarul ghaban. Ghaban is when you get ripped off so bad, like the seller completely duped you, and you ended up paying 30, 40, maybe 100, 200% higher price than was actually warranted. In that situation, the customer can legally oblige the seller to return that product. So there are different khiyar that are built into our deen, and I would encourage the business people who are running their business to look into that and not let the fear of losing on a profit sway them away, deter them from actually resorting to this. This is something very important. Again, I like to not only just recommend practices, but worldviews and philosophies that underpin those actions. One philosophy for y'all, and again, another nugget in my opinion, and that is, oftentimes you and I have the pixel, God has the picture. It's a very important concept. A businessman who's running his business and he's doing something shady, he's like, you know what, the moment the customer leaves, I don't even know him. You're a stranger to me. I've never seen your face. Get out of my face. How dare you come back and return a product? Let's say they have this type of a cutthroat mindset, and they're doing this because they're like, I gotta protect my profit, I got kids to feed. So they're only looking at their little circle of life, and what benefits them. Yeah, but see this right here, if everybody operated like that, then a society becomes unfriendly for doing businesses. And then what happens? The forest kicks in, and now foreign companies who are looking at Pakistan, for instance, and the business environment in Pakistan, are they likely to make the investment? Are they likely to channel funding there? No. So at a pixel level, everybody thinks they're like, oh, I'm protecting my territory. But at the larger macro level, we all are losing out because foreign investment is drying up. This is where, when you and I uphold ethical practices, in the short term, it may seem that you're losing out. Long term, it eventually catches up to you. And I feel like this is a great rule of success in life. You have two choices in life. You either chill now and suffer later,
Right.
or you sacrifice now and chill later. Oh, you have to decide. Similarly with ethics, like I used to work for Eaton Corporation, and every company that reports to Wall Street faces a lot of pressure. At the end of every quarter, you got to hit the numbers. Now, this is exactly where managers feel the pressure to bend accounting rules to show a little higher income than they actually have. We'll release a reserve there. We'll pull in this little reserve here. We'll tweak the numbers here. Whatever necessary to boost the income. If everybody starts engaging these shady practices over a period of time, what happens? As happened in 2008, bubble collapsed. Balloon was punctured. The entire housing market came tumbling down. And what happened? The long-term disaster kind of kicked in. So obviously it's a balancing act, short-term versus long-term, and we're all aware of that. But this idea of pixel versus a picture is a very important mindset, that you don't want to live in a silo, selfish existence, because that drop makes the river. So back to the refund policy, I know, back to the actual practical examples, khiyar is a legitimate thing in our religion, and I encourage people to look into this. And one other thing I would mention here, people who are doing business, they should take the time to learn fiqh of doing business. It's not enough that you know how to pray, mashallah, that's great. But there's fiqh involved in how you manage commercial enterprises, partnerships. That should be learned. Like if somebody ever opens a book of fiqh, 30% of book of fiqh is actually ibadat, 70% is muamalat. Business, loans, marriage, divorce. There's so much that goes into it. And people are our Islamiyat curriculum is whack, in my opinion, which is where that comes from. What's the second area, Khurram, you mentioned?
Okay, so I think we are running out of time. So let me come to the very important thing, and I kept it to the last because that's where businesses need finance. I mean, that's their the air. That's what the businesses breathe. They continuously need the financing, and especially if you look at it, like for instance, all the new these ventures. I mean, in the recent history, like Facebook, Tesla, Microsoft. I mean, even if you don't go to the Microsoft and Apple, I mean, the most recent ones like Instagram and all those new ones, Uber, in past 10, 15 years, 20 years, they literally gone through the roof. They became the unicorn. They have created so much wealth in the world that is just mind-boggling. It hasn't happened in the past, but it all happened because there was this financing was available. There was cash injection to all these businesses. Now, there is one fundamental thing attached with it. Like if you go to the conventional banking, which is the interest, and I mean, everybody knows what the actual take on interest is from the Islamic point of view. Now, we have seen when the actual, this financing comes in through the private channels, when the VCs come in or the angel investors come in, there isn't much interest involved in those things. Like for instance, when you actually put in your investment, let's say whatever, like maybe $1 million, and you take the equity against this 20%, purely Islamic. There's nothing about un-Islamic in that. But when you go to the conventional businesses, you have to actually go to the gas station, and then you're just about to buy in a $5 million transaction. Then you go to the bank and try to then you get the financing done from there, and there's an interest attached with it. So on the both elements, please shed some light. First of all, how to deal with the interest, and I'm not going to actually comment on that, yes or no and all that. and then have a justification on top of that people actually give that, okay, you cannot move forward without it. And the second element, that yes, there are Islamic options available, this is not stopping you to do the business.
Yeah, man, that is a hot button issue today. And like as you mentioned earlier, everybody knows where Islam stands on interest. I think as Muslims are aware that pork is haram, khinzir is haram, interest is that or worse. So that is out in the open. The question is, there isn't a enterprise in the world right now, except particularly in the Western world and even in the Eastern world, except that it has some level of interest built into it. I mean, you take Apple, for instance, who makes products and phones and computers or whatever. Yeah, but they have cash reserves upwards of $200 billion. What are they going to do with that cash? They're going to invest it into a bank or in some sort of a short liquid investments, and they're going to make some money, and they're guaranteed that return, and therefore there's interest income that is built into it. It's inescapable. And subhanAllah, this reminds me of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that towards the end of times, there's no one who can escape riba. And people who claim to escape riba are also affected by the dharrat of riba, the particles of riba. And subhanAllah, how true is that? You invest in Apple, but that little portion of interest income is baked into your dividends. You can't escape it. Having said that, what do we do now? Here, I like to share with you what I feel very strongly about, and that is, I feel like Muslims for the longest time, particularly from the era of colonialism, I mean, from 17th century onwards, but particularly it became more pronounced after colonialism, and that is we're playing catch up. We're in the reactive game. We're not on the proactive game. We react to the environment. We don't shape the environment. So interest is a business reality, and it's very difficult to get a loan without that interest element being attached to it. And people are like, how do I survive? Well, you don't think there are alternatives that could be erected? Venture capitalism, the Awqaf model, Muslims pooling their assets and creating a fund, or some sort of a public funding model of some sort, where the person who gives you the loan is not asking for interest, but a portion of your business stake, and you give that person shares in loss and profit equally. Because the whole thing that Sharia doesn't like is that when one party is guaranteed income and the other party bears all the liability. So people who may be wondering why interest is so problematic in Islam, let me break it down to you in a very, very small way. In Islam, a valid business transaction is when each side gets something from the transaction. So if the seller is getting the money, which is a commodity, the buyer is getting the actual commodity, so the equation balances out. What happens in interest? I'm giving money. I'm the one getting the money. The other side is going to eventually get that money back and more. What did I get? The one who pays the interest. Nothing except time. So one party inevitably loses out no matter what, which is why in capitalism, in my humble analysis, rich get richer. Why? Because take someone like Jeff Bezos. He's got a net worth of upwards of 100 billions. He's got so much spare money lying around. What is he going to do? He's going to take that money, throw it into a bank, and the bank is going to give him, let's say, 5%. Well, I ask you, where does the bank get the 5% to give to Jeff Bezos? They take his 100 billion that he has stored in the bank, package them as loans to students, to entrepreneurs, to small business owners, and they charge them. You know, the credit card interest rate is 20%. So the bank make a killing of the portion of that 20% they're going to give to Jeff Bezos, who earned 5% without moving a finger, just got richer. And who's bearing the brunt of that? The middle class on the bottom. Rich get richer, poor feel the squeeze. That's how over the last 20 years or last 40 years, if you look at the gap between the wealthy and the rich has gotten wider and wider. Right now, and I challenge you to look this up, 45% of the wealth in the world is owned by 1%. All they have to do is keep making interest, and no, you can never play catch up because it's guaranteed money. In Islam, the one who earns the privilege also bears the liability. That equation always has to be maintained. So if somebody's looking for funding, venture capitalism is a great idea because you are an owner in that business. And if the business prospers, you share in prosperity. If it loses, you lose in that. I encourage Muslims to come up with those type of models. Islamic banking is making progress, particularly Mufti Taqi Uthmani and others have, grown things in leaps and bounds, but it's still, Islamic banking is in its infancy. It really is. And I'm gonna be honest with y'all, it's actually more expensive going down the Islamic banking route. But that's that's what this dunya is. It's a place of test. Halal meat is more expensive than your pick and save meat.
Right.
It, it,
But
that's
but the thing is, on the halal meat example, like for instance, I'll give you an example of UK. So for instance, it was a similar sort of scenario where, I mean, halal meat was more expensive 20 years ago, but over the time, because of this, sheer amount of halal meat coming into the market, everything was halal. So now even the mainstream meat is halal, and that's gone so cheaper that you would get, not non-zabiha. I mean, over there's no concept of zabiha or non-zabiha. There's halal and haram. That's it. So their haram meat is more expensive than the halal meat.
yes.
So the sheer supply of the halal money into the market would ultimately make it a lot more cheaper, and that's one of the actual comments or complaints people do, that when you actually go towards the Islamic banking, that's a lot more expensive, and that's somehow becomes that it's not viable option for you. So if it's Islamic and it's expensive, then so be it. So you be prepared to actually pay a little bit extra on that. Now, we are like literally last few minutes of the actual session, and there's a lot of demand coming in from people who are watching it to actually do a lot more.
Can I just quickly make a comment? You know how you mentioned Islamic banking is a lot more expensive, or halal meat is more expensive, and I'm telling you again, not to drag the conversation towards the religious side. This world, wallahi, is a fine-tuned domain of being tested. In every macro aspect of life, this tussle, this battle, this imtihan will manifest itself. Which is why Islam, the word Islam itself means what? Submission. You have to submit. It's not easy. It's gonna take a little bit of struggle. A person who feels a pinch because they're losing more money, because let's say they're going down the Islamic banking route, their bottom line will get affected more so than a person who's going to the conventional route. They will. But if there's an element of hereafter, that cost is easy to bear. This is the whole thing. And this is where Allah rewards you for your submission. If submission was a walk in a park, what are you getting rewarded for? Is the Prophet ﷺ used to say, "Fafimal Jannah." What is Jannah? Do you want to enter Jannah for free? The cost, the extra cost you pay now is well worth if there's an element of hereafter. And this is why Iman is so important. A Muslim businessman operating without a proper foundation of Iman, every loss of doing halal business is a permanent loss for you. And you're going to feel like you're cheated out, shortchanged, it's unfair, life sucks, and how come I have it worse than the other? But if you look at, once again, I go back to the principle, if you look at not just the pixel, but the grand picture, which includes this world and the hereafter, you understand that's the real cost of doing business that will really pay off. As you pay for licensing, as you pay for initial investment, think of doing business in a halal way. That investment that may not immediately pay here, but is definitely going to pay there. It comes down to grounding yourself in Iman and making unseen seen as possible. Understanding the intellectual arguments for the hereafter. Grounding yourself properly. It's so crucial. Otherwise, man, you're going to suffocate because you're going to keep looking at your bank balance that dips because you're paying more for doing business right or halal or in an ethical way. And it's going to hurt you. Hereafter has to come in. There's no, wallahi, there's no morality without hereafter. I tell you, take hereafter out of the picture, everything just becomes an abstract discussion. Just philosophical mumbo jumbo, verbal gymnastics. Moment you introduce hereafter, now morality is activated,
So basically today's session was about this, but before we actually go, and I do the summary of all the points, I would ask one more time, to look into what we have discussed, and if one single important element, especially from the people perspective who are actually getting on this ladder, who are thinking, especially the youth, because for me, the most important thing is when the person actually looks at it, and this entrepreneurship thing is becoming like such a buzzword that everybody wants to actually try it out at least once in their lifetime. So even if they are not actually embarking on it right after graduation, they are actually thinking about it maybe like when they're 40, 45, that, okay, let's try something out. Let's get involved in some sort of business. So it's becoming this sort of like a buzzword, but what should be the values? And this is the key element, and that's why we are actually doing these sessions. And we have discussed, I've discussed with Ameer that we're going to be doing a series of sessions on this particular topic and few other topics on morality and then actual customs and what was the actual culture from the actual in the past. So please, final summary from your or any particular word from this discussion we had just now.
For me, final word.
Mm.
Final advice that I would give. I mean, if I'm a Mayman, so business is in our blood. So alhamdulillah, I'm actually thinking about starting a business myself eventually. The idea that I like to hold on to is the idea that certain things are simply just not worth it. And I think that really was what ultimately things boil down to. Is it worth it? The extra money that I'm making because of certain practice that I uphold or do not uphold, is it worth it? If your definition of worth is just this world, it is worth it. I do want to get into Beverly Hills. I do want to move up to that fancy zip code. I do want to rock my Tesla keys, mashallah. It is worth it because all your, because your horizon extends just to this world. But if you were to extend your horizons beyond, then your definition of worth changes. And then you're like, I don't know if it's worth it. Sure, I just hit 7 figures in profit, but I don't know if it's worth it anymore. I don't know if I want to gamble my second world. You have to define what worth is for yourself. And based on what your definition of worth is and what your definition of ultimate profitability is, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf says it beautifully. Everyone is driven by profit, either profit with an F or profit with a PH. Well, you decide which one. You have to define that for yourself. Wherever that definition lies, you will make choices accordingly. That is the ultimate metaphysical, imani, unseen conviction you have to decide for yourself. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us to the truth. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen.
Okay, thanks, Ameer. Was great discussion, and inshallah we're going to be doing a lot more. So today's discussion was about how we going to embark on this journey, which is going to need all these tools but the inner peace that this is exactly what we are doing. This is how it should be done. We shouldn't be doing hanky-panky with that. We shouldn't be actually looking into malpractices. We shouldn't be looking into short-term goals. So, I mean, you heard it all. So most important thing for me as well, what in final words, what Shaykh Ameer Hamza said was that, is it worth it? Whatever you're trying to do, if you're trying to cut the corners, is it worth it? If you're trying to do a milawat into anything, is it worth it? If you're trying to jack up the prices, is it worth it? If you're trying to actually create that quality which is not to the highest standard and cutting the corners, is it worth it? So just ask on every single point that whether whatever you're trying to do is worth it. And inshallah, we're going to be actually doing a lot more sessions on this. So until next time, inshallah, from me, Allah Hafiz and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
On this massacre of school children in Pakistan.
You think we are a nation who is only known for terrorism, but you're not aware that we own it when it comes to optimism. You can keep on thinking of the odds and stay in fright, or you can trust the facts you're about to witness by sight. We're not the troublemakers that the world think we are. We have achieved a lot that is enough to remove this scar. Let's start believing that our economy holds great potential and step forward to explore the prospects, cause that's essential. We're not just a remarkable marks present only in the past. Instead, we still hold potential to show the world we're blessed. We were an economy who was followed by others. We got shattered a bit, but stood again to aim for treasures. We made mistakes, faced the consequences, and suffered. This taught us a lot and enabled us to keep ourselves covered. We moved hills, gained titles, and made many other records. Our nation survived the turmoil and made its way through hazards. How can you doubt a nation who doesn't give up at any cost? Pakistan always come back on track when the world think it's lost. We're tough, skilled, talented, and unstoppable. You can check the stats to see how much we're capable. No matter you are national, regional, or international investor, our country has so much to offer. You just name the sector. We're coming forward with the conference of the year. Will you amiably join hands with us and provide your share?